In 1970, there were fewer than 300,000 Americans in our jails and prisons. By 2008, that number was 2.3 million. Even after adjusting for population increase, an American in 2008 was 5 times as likely to be in prison as they were in 1970. Some people like to blame President Clinton, and we'll get to him in time, but there's a reason I started over 20 years before Clinton became president. That reason is the true root cause for the prison population explosion. In 1971, President Nixon announced that drug abuse was public enemy number one. His brief speech included a request for money from Congress, nearly doubling the amount that was already being spent to combat drug abuse. What became known as the war on drugs is the real cause of the prison population explosion. And it's the topic for this episode of Progressive Solutions. As always, I want to hear from you. What experience do you have with efforts to limit drug use, and how effective are they? What do you think would be the best way to combat it? Write your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you like this video, please hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you'll be notified when future videos come out. And spread the word. There are lots of progressive solutions. Many people would be surprised to learn that Nixon's speech only mentioned law enforcement in passing. His primary focus was on rehabilitation of drug users, along with research and education to support that effort. The harsher stuff would come later. That harsher stuff would get a huge boost from an unlikely source. At the 1964 Republican Convention, a governor got booed nearly off the stage for daring to suggest that Republicans repudiate the extremism of the KKK, the Communist Party, and the John Birch Society. That was the liberal governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller. In late 1972, Rockefeller, who had tried a couple of things to combat the growing use of drugs to no avail, suddenly changed course. He announced his change at the State of the State address on January 3, 1973, and the laws that were passed became known as the Rockefeller Drug Laws. These laws were the toughest in the nation, and other states soon followed suit. But even Rockefeller had no intention of locking up drug users. His call was for life imprisonment for drug dealers only, and users who committed violent crimes. So, how did this lead to mass incarceration? In 1994, former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman gave an interview in which he claimed that Nixon's entire war on drugs was all about racism. Nixon was a racist, that much we know, but his racism probably had little or nothing to do with the war on drugs. But racism certainly played a large part in how the war was fought. Black people were far more likely to be arrested and prosecuted for having drugs, despite the fact that they were no more likely to use or deal drugs than white people. Drug laws born of racism are nothing new. Opium was perfectly legal until Chinese railroad workers started using it. Cocaine was only outlawed after a New York Times headline screamed about the Negro cocaine fiend. And marijuana was only criminalized because people claimed that immigrant Mexican farm workers were using it. Racism has always played a major part in drug laws, why they were written and how they were enforced. So it should have been expected that the war on drugs would have racism as a major part of it. Another factor is how laws originally designed only to catch drug dealers were used to catch drug users in huge numbers. Rockefeller laws included cash payouts to informants. An informant would tell on a dealer, the dealer would get arrested, and the informant would get paid. Police were eager to catch and lock up drug dealers, but most high-level dealers were very careful not to get caught. Also, most informants didn't want to inform on their dealers. Partly because they didn't want to lose their source for drugs, but mostly because they feared retribution. So police found another way to catch people dealing drugs in order to pump up their arrest numbers. They would offer a drug user cash in order to buy drugs from another user, and then the police would arrest that one-time seller. This seller, who didn't generally sell drugs, was arrested, the informant would be paid, and the big-time dealers would stay safe. The Rockefeller concept of connecting drug use with crime and law enforcement's arrest and imprisonment of low-level drug users under the guise of getting tough on crime caught on nationwide and expanded. 3 strikes laws, minimum sentences, all these ideas are still around. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration tried Nancy Reagan's Just Say No idea. While drug use didn't increase a lot during the 80s, it didn't come down either. Oh yeah, and it didn't work. Crime continued to increase for the next 20 years. All tough on crime did during the first 20 years was triple the prison population, clog the courts, and cost taxpayers billions of dollars for construction and maintenance of the new prisons. And what's worse, drug users started shifting to more dangerous drugs like crack cocaine. And as more money was being spent on arresting and imprisoning people and far less was helping get people off drugs, the war on drugs was being lost. Meanwhile, independent research was beginning to yield results for drug treatment programs. That research has continued, and while we have made progress, we still have a long way to go. Then came the Clinton Crime Bill, or bills. Some of the measures were actually quite good, like the Violence Against Women Act or the assault weapons ban. But the others, not so much. Some key controversial provisions include the Federal Death Penalty Act, which added about 60 crimes to the list of things for which you could be executed. I've done a video on the death penalty. You can see the link up here, and I'll also put it in the description below. The Clinton crime bills also stripped a provision from the Higher Education Act of 1965 that provided funding to prisoners to get a college education. This consigned many prisoners to a life of crime, and it threw away a major path to rehabilitation. Then there was the COPS program, or Community-Oriented Policing program. This was the big selling point to the public. They were going to provide funding to put 100,000 additional police officers in the street to provide community policing. At least that was the idea. The program did jumpstart community-oriented policing in some places, but not nearly as much as it was touted, and a lot of the money was redirected to making more arrests. As the result, its effectiveness in cutting crime was minimal, according to a 2005 GAO report. Meanwhile, the one effect that is undebatable was that the prison population, which had tripled in the 20 years leading up to the Clinton crime bill, more than doubled in the 20 years afterward, even as crime rates, which had begun falling before Clinton took office, continued to fall. And its effect on drug use was basically nil. The only effect it had was to lock up a few more drug users, while the vast majority of drug users never got arrested. Meanwhile, the U.S. was trying a variety of ways to stop drugs from coming into the country. Heroin from Afghanistan, cocaine from Colombia, marijuana and other drugs from, as well as passing through, Mexico, and a whole lot more. All of these supply-side attempts to reduce drug production and importation have failed. In 2017, for instance, Colombia produced a record amount of cocaine. Meanwhile, drug use in America is at or near record highs. More recently, prescription drugs are being used and abused a lot more. This is the current opioid crisis. Drug overdoses now kill more Americans than car accidents and guns combined, and most of those drug overdoses are the direct result of addiction to prescription drugs. And while hundreds of thousands of Americans, an overabundance of them being black or Hispanic, are locked up for years or decades on low-level drug use charges, celebrities who get caught rarely face prison time. When a war on, anything, really becomes a de facto war on being poor or being a person of color, it's time to make peace and change goals, strategies, and tactics. Fortunately, that's what seems to be happening. State after state is legalizing marijuana use, and there's now a push at the federal level to remove marijuana from the list of Schedule I drugs. Laws are being passed to release drug users from prison and even expunge their records. Other countries across Europe and elsewhere have decriminalized a wide variety of drugs. Some even make drugs available to addicts. The result? Addiction, violence, and a whole host of health problems have gone way down. Basically, America is beginning to realize that we can't win the war on drugs through force and violence against drug users. We need a completely different approach. One alternative approach would involve community-oriented policing. True community-oriented policing means that police officers work with community members, neighborhood organizations, and academic researchers to help keep people out of trouble, and to help people who start to get into trouble get out before things get worse. It assumes that different communities have different problems and different needs and different solutions. It also takes time not only to learn the particular needs of a community, but also to develop relations with the people who live in those neighborhoods. This ground-level method can be combined with higher-level programs to open new pathways to success for more people. If people can find success and happiness without drugs, most of them won't turn to drugs. We've tried reducing demand through direct action, such as Nancy Reagan's Just Say No initiative and the associated DARE program, and also other programs such as the one based on the video series Scared Straight. They didn't work. They don't work because they all miss a vital component for success, providing reasonable alternatives. If you tell somebody that they shouldn't do something because it's bad for them, that probably won't change their odds of doing it. But if you give them a better alternative, you'll have some success. We do need to educate young people on the dangers of drug use, but we also need to provide viable alternatives that significantly reduce the temptation to use drugs. We should also look at how drugs, as well as drug use and abuse, have changed over time. Heroin, morphine, and other opiates, for example, have a long history. Opium poppies were cultivated for their euphoric effects over 5,000 years ago, and they've been used medicinally and recreationally around the world for a long time. But it wasn't until the mid-19th century that methods were developed for extracting the potent chemicals and delivering them in a highly addictive manner. That was a turning point for opium. Can we, in effect, turn back time? Can we find a way to reintroduce opium and other drugs in ways that aren't as addictive and have milder effects? I use opium as an example because heroin is one of the most highly dangerous and addictive drugs on the criminal market. If we can restore opium to its pre-19th century effects, perhaps we can do the same with other milder drugs. And should we? Should we allow our society to become one where so many people take drugs? Well, we already have. Alcohol is a mild and sometimes addictive drug, and yet the vast majority of Americans consume it, quite a lot of it. We tried getting rid of it, and now we focus on trying to limit its use to non-destructive levels. Perhaps that approach could be the most effective with other drugs. Finally, we need to take a hard look at what pharmaceutical companies are doing. Purdue Pharma has pleaded guilty to a variety of crimes related to its marketing of the opioid OxyContin. The corporation has to pay billions of dollars in fines, and its board members have to pay hundreds of millions each. And that's just one company. Purdue Pharma isn't alone, and other pharmaceutical companies will, if they aren't already, find ways to push drugs that do more harm than good in their relentless pursuit of a better bottom line. They need to be held accountable. So, what do you think? How should we deal with drugs? Did you like any of these approaches, or do you recommend something else? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Stay progressive.